August 6, 1945. Deep beneath Tokyo's sweltering summer streets, the Imperial General Headquarters braced itself for another routine day, grappling with a war slipping ever further from their grasp. What shattered the usual monotony was not the echo of distant artillery, nor the familiar drone of morning briefings, but a scrambled message from Hiroshima, a single lone broadcast that punctured 3 years of unwavering belief in Japan's capacity to endure the industrial onslaught. In an instant, illusions dissolved. The leadership realized the Americans had never unleashed the full extent of their power. Restraint, not exhaustion, had guided their hand. The heavily fortified basement war room, buried 90 feet down and encased in thick concrete, buzzed with subdued anxiety. Field Marshal Hada's daily report ritual had devolved into little more than a somber tallying of setback after setback. Then, precisely at 8:15, Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Yamamoto burst in, disregarding protocol, grip white-knuckled around a decoded transmission that would force Japan's senior commanders to finally see the war for what it had become. The message arrived in broken fragments, issued by Hiroshima's own regional command just before the city fell silent. Its contents were stark. One bomb, unprecedented scale, devastation beyond anything previously witnessed, unfathomable casualties, and, most chillingly, no further communication. General Umezu, presiding over the staff, read the report again and again, mind wrestling with its implications. His first instinct drew him toward the familiar. This must be a massive raid, hundreds of bombers, perhaps the largest conventional attack ever conducted. But the story unfolding in those lines simply wouldn't add up. The old patterns had finally broken. Within those concrete walls, as the transmission reverberated through their ranks, the Japanese High Command would be forced to confront a reality more terrifying than defeat itself. The enemy they thought they understood had not even begun to show their true hand. In the hours that followed, a tense unease settled over the command center as analysts raced to make sense of what little intelligence they had. The room was thick with the sense of a tide shifting, one that could not be reversed by strategy or sacrifice. At first, the core assumption prevailed. Perhaps the Americans had mounted their most enormous bombing raid yet, unleashing an overwhelming force of hundreds of aircraft. After all, Hiroshima was a vast metropolis, home to more than 350,000 people, its neighborhoods sprawling across dozens of square miles. The very notion that a single weapon could erase such a city seemed inconceivable. But new reports arrived with unnerving frequency, each challenging the norms of industrial warfare the Japanese command had come to expect. Weather patrols reported seeing just 3 B-29s above Hiroshima that morning. 3, not 300. On the massive wall map, Admiral Toyota's staff, experts in reading the patterns of American air power, found themselves speechless. In all their years, nothing suggested a handful of bombers could do this. By mid-morning, daring reconnaissance pilots attempting to reach the ruined city described a scene from another world. A mushroom cloud, rising 40,000 feet, its colors flickering and electric. Strange hues never before witnessed in war. The enormity of the moment landed hardest when Foreign Minister Togo heard the first civilian account. A railway man, safe only by virtue of being miles away, recounted a blinding flash, the violent upheaval of trains, and entire neighborhoods dissolving into a firestorm that could be seen from distant hills. The war the High Command thought they understood was gone. In its place was something new and terrifyingly unknowable. By early afternoon, the Supreme War Council gathered in a silence more oppressive than any air raid. Across the long table, Prime Minister Suzuki's hands trembled as he reviewed the mounting evidence. The council's mood was tense. each man turning over the news in the privacy of his own dread. The destruction of Hiroshima prompted Minister of War Anami, the most fervent voice for continued resistance, to be the first to speak. He dismissed the reports as clever deception, claiming it was nothing but an exaggerated conventional bombing, a trick designed to force their surrender. Normally, such skepticism might have carried the day, but not now. Admiral Toyota, usually reserved and orderly in his interventions, cut in abruptly. 3 aircraft, Anami-san, not 300. The plain statement hung in the air, heavier than any accusation, and left the council stunned. For 3 years, Japan's leadership anchored their hopes in a central belief that American industry, no matter how powerful, could be checked by Japanese ingenuity and spirit. Yet the scale of Hiroshima's annihilation hinted at something far more disturbing, an American capacity for destruction that rendered all prior calculations irrelevant. A hush filled the bunker as years of doctrine and propaganda began to unravel. The core premise, that courage and tactical brilliance could tip the scales against industrial giants, wavered, exposed by the unthinkable. A single bomb had achieved what waves of conventional attacks never could. As fresh intelligence trickled in throughout the day, shattered fragments of reality replaced speculation. By 10 a.m., reconnaissance crews sent back accounts unlike anything seen before, an immense column blossoming above the city, glowing with strange, ethereal colors. Pilots spoke of a pulse in the sky, a radiance both beautiful and terrifying as the aftermath of the explosion reverberated outward. Foreign Minister Togo, eager for first-hand evidence, received testimony from a railway worker caught miles away from Ground Zero. The man's account signaled a new threshold in warfare, an explosion brighter than anything he'd ever witnessed, a shockwave so intense it hurled trains off tracks and erased entire neighborhoods in seconds. The city center, he reported, had simply disappeared. In its place, a swirling inferno, visible from mountain ridges far beyond the city limits. Every new report intensified the realization in the command bunker. This wasn't just a new kind of attack. It was the unveiling of a power beyond the known boundaries of military science and strategy. Within hours, the Japanese leadership began reckoning with forces that eclipsed every expectation they'd held since the war began. That afternoon, the Supreme War Council convened under a cloud of silent dread. The gravity of the reports was undeniable, yet old instincts persisted. Prime Minister Suzuki broke the hush, voice trembling as he addressed his colleagues with the fatal documents laid out before him. "We must face what this means," he began, his words dusted with the weight of everything unspoken. General Anami, never shy to champion defiance, clung to the position that this must be American propaganda. He insisted the destruction of Hiroshima was merely a conventional attack, amplified by rumors and fear. Yet Admiral Toyota, breaking protocol with a rare interruption, corrected him with simple facts. 3 planes, not hundreds, had been observed by their own trackers. This intrusion cut through the council's resistance, laying bare an unsettling truth. Everything they believed about the enemy was suddenly without mooring. The room descended into a hush that felt both mournful and accusatory. For the first time, Japan's leadership began to recognize the collapse of their core assumptions, a quiet but seismic shift, as if the very foundation beneath their feet had cracked open. For years, Japan's military doctrine had rested on a single, unwavering calculation: that American supremacy in factories and shipyards could be blunted by the intensity and ingenuity of Japanese soldiers. The logic was seductive. American losses would swell to such unbearable levels that their will to wage war would collapse. Every battle since Pearl Harbor had been channeled through this lens, transforming industrial output into a contest of resilience, spirit, and sacrifice. Statistics reinforce the illusion. Though American factories churned out hundreds of thousands of planes and ships, Japan's top brass held fast to the belief that a single aviator brimming with resolve could equal 10 demoralized Americans. When enemy convoys filled the seas and new bombers arrived faster than U-boats could sink them, generals reassured themselves that technology was no match for the heart of a warrior. But Hiroshima tore this narrative apart. With one bomb, America made clear that their power wasn't just overwhelming, it was operating on a level Japan's strategists had never dared imagine. The idea that Japanese honor could outlast American machinery suddenly felt like wishful thinking. And, in the basement war room, leaders were forced to reckon with the stark possibility that the very foundation of their strategy had been built on a fatal misunderstanding. To truly grasp the moment of revelation facing Japan's military elite, one must remember the warnings delivered years before. In November 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, esteemed fleet commander and seasoned observer of American society, had offered the most unvarnished appraisal of U.S. industrial power. His predictions were neither hopeful nor nationalistic, but grounded in first-hand experience. Yamamoto had lived, studied, and worked in America, touring factories whose scale dwarfed anything found in Japan. He cautioned, "If war is to come, I can run wild for a few months, perhaps a year, but after that, I harbor no illusions." The Navy kept detailed records of these remarks, yet Yamamoto's sober calculations were cast aside in favor of more palatable narratives. Japan's steel production was mere shadow beside America's reserves. Imports kept engines running, but American wells never ran dry. Practical limits, not patriotism, shaped the admiral's views. Still, the staff who now weighed Hiroshima's destruction in the bunker had ignored these warnings from the outset, trusting instead in distance, morale, and tactical edge as the keys to neutralizing a far larger adversary. The Army's pre-war plans, now surfacing from historical records, revealed the alternate story Japan's leadership clung to as the tides of conflict rose. They wagered that American industry, for all its scale, would be neutralized by three decisive factors. First, the sheer vastness of the Pacific, a defensive perimeter so extensive that logistics would swallow American power in an endless ocean. With supply lines stretching thousands of miles, Japan's proximity to its conquered territories was seen as a trump card. Second, morale. The image of American society was cast as soft and fragmented, a population assumed to recoil at heavy losses, unwilling to pay the price of prolonged war. In this script, Japanese soldiers' unrivaled willingness to die would outlast any surge of Western sentiment. Third, tactical superiority. Through unyielding training and relentless fighting spirit, Japanese units believed they could inflict casualties so disproportionate that numbers alone would fail to guarantee American victory. One Japanese warrior, according to doctrine, was equivalent to several Americans in the field. These convictions endured battle after battle, unshaken even as evidence accumulated to the contrary. Leadership recast defeat as unlucky aberration, always calling for minor adjustments rather than root and branch rethinking. In the bunker, facing Hiroshima's silence, leaders finally had to reckon with the true price of self-deception. As the war wore on, these treasured assumptions repeatedly collided with the harshness of combat. At Midway in June 1942, Japan suffered the sudden loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single strike, an outcome the official narrative pinned on misfortune and trivial command errors, never acknowledging that American code-breaking and tactical innovation changed the rules entirely. On the blood-soaked islands of Guadalcanal, where fighting raged for months, Japanese forces discovered that Americans not only persevered across treacherous supply routes, but also matched their resolve in the jungle itself. Here, headquarters again blamed local shortcomings and insufficient fighting spirit, never questioning the possibility that their adversaries' capabilities were simply greater. By August 1945, each building block of Japan's wartime thinking had been dismantled by reality. Yet the senior leadership, unwilling to admit defeat even to themselves, clung to these outdated beliefs. General Anami's dogged insistence on fighting to the last citizen betrayed not foolishness, but the logical dead end of years spent doubling down on illusions. Hiroshima became the unyielding mirror. Finally, the command structure would have to confront the fracture between the world they imagined and the one the war had truly wrought. That afternoon marked a historic break in mindset. Colonel Sato, heading intelligence, presented his team's reality assessment, a report painstakingly compiled then shelved as too damning to share. The numbers were unforgiving. America's plane production in 1944 alone exceeded the grand total of Japan's output for the entire war. Shipyards built escort carriers with a speed Japan couldn't hope to rival. Ammunition factories outpaced Japan's monthly yield in the span of a week. But it was the scale of scientific enterprise that most unsettled the Council. American research had become an engine of innovation, recruiting over 130,000 scientists and engineers for military advancement. In comparison, Japan's effort amounted to a fraction, a mere 6,000 in total. Universities like Harvard, MIT, and Berkeley boasted physics departments as large as Japan's entire technical community. Colonel Sato laid it out bluntly. The atomic bomb demanded facilities beyond Japan's imagination, let alone its capacity. America had secretly built entire cities dedicated to a single purpose, devouring more energy and resources than Japan's major urban centers. The Manhattan Project alone cost more than Japan's war effort for all of 1944, a truth now impossible to ignore. Foreign Minister Togo voiced the question lingering in every mind. How could such vast American endeavors go unnoticed by Japanese intelligence? Colonel Sato responded with chilling candor. Reports had streamed in for years detailing U.S. industrial and scientific expansion, intercepted communications, and frantic recruitment of technical talent. Yet every warning, every detailed analysis had been waved aside as either exaggeration or enemy propaganda. The crux was not ignorance, but willful blindness. Knowing would mean accepting that Japan could never win. Admiral Toyota's words were the bitter summation of their predicament. America fought with one hand restrained, dominating Germany and Japan, while building weapons we could scarcely imagine. Their factories produced more than physics seemed to allow, all without sacrificing civilian prosperity. They weren't simply stronger. They were operating from a higher plane of civilization. For years, official rhetoric painted Americans as weak, dependent on wealth and technology, lacking resolve. Now the advent of the atomic bomb made plain just how calamitously wrong that narrative had been. The psychological blow was staggering and swift. Cabinet Secretary Sakomizu recorded in his diary that evening, "We have been fighting an enemy we never understood. We saw our own reflection in them, assuming their vulnerabilities were ours." The shock of Hiroshima exposed just how wrong those assumptions had been. It wasn't only material power now overwhelming Japan, but also a gap in imagination, strategy, and recognition. A palpable discomfort rippled through the Council. Reports and analyses that had previously been brushed aside as pessimism or defeatism now became their grim reality. Propaganda's mirror finally shattered. Optimism had served as a shield against truths too uncomfortable to face. Day by day, the leadership's will to deny faded. The war was no longer a contest of attrition or morale. It had become a demonstration of just how thoroughly one nation can outpace another in the science of destruction. the morning of August 7th broke with eerie confirmation. Japanese reconnaissance finally succeeded in crossing into Hiroshima's devastated airspace, transmitting photographs that stunned even hardened analysts. Major Sun Kitamura, pilot of the first successful overflight, returned with reports of weather phenomena so extreme that his aircraft was thrown skyward by violent updrafts. The haze, dense columns of smoke reaching the stratosphere, obscured any familiar landmarks. Developed images revealed the city's center had been razed beyond recognition. Streets were not clogged with rubble. Instead, entire structures had been vaporized, leaving nothing but exposed earth within a mile of the blast. Analysts compared these photos to the aftermath of Tokyo's Great Firebombing, where hundreds of bombers and thousands of tons of incendiaries had left behind scorched but recognizable outlines. In Hiroshima, though, a single weapon had done more in an instant than the largest raid in history had achieved over hours. The gravity of the situation deepened when news arrived from Moscow. Overnight, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov had summoned Japan's representative with a terse announcement. Within days, the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan. Any hope of brokering peace through Soviet mediation evaporated instantly. With atomic bombs raining from the sky and Soviet armies mobilizing in the north, Japan's strategic calculus collapsed. Now, defeat loomed from every direction. With their last diplomatic lifeline severed, the High Command rapidly reeled from the implications. Japan now faced an encirclement that offered no hope of negotiation or survival by the old rules. In an emergency council, Foreign Minister Togo made the options explicit. Surrender without conditions, endure the systematic destruction of every city by atomic attack, or fight until both Soviet and American forces stamped out Japan as a nation. The room was silent. There were no illusions left. As if to drive despair deeper, fragmentary reports from Manchuria revealed the Soviet Army's advance. Veteran Japanese units, once considered elite, were being routed in days. The Soviets, themselves equipped via vast U.S. military aid, surged forward, their vehicles and supplies testifying to the overwhelming reach of American industry. The Lend-Lease program alone had funneled to Russia more hardware and resources than Japan could muster through the entire war. Within days, the circle closed. Atomic weapons pummeled Japan from above. The Red Army crashed through northern territories, and resistance in China continued without relief. The commanders, once dreaming of empire from India to the Pacific, now saw those ambitions crushed, battered by enemies on all sides. On August 9th, the unimaginable repeated itself. At 11:02, Nagasaki vanished in a second atomic blast. This time, the transmission from local command was even briefer. Second atomic attack, city destroyed, casualties catastrophic. And then the line went dead. The Supreme War Council met in a session more fraught than any before. With no hope of stopping the bombings and no chance of Soviet mediation, the reality of total defeat was now undeniable. Navy Minister Jonai spoke with an honesty rare for wartime Japan. The Americans, he said, possess the power to obliterate cities at will, rendering Japanese defenses, or even strategies, utterly irrelevant. Their warplanes could strike unseen, and no force or fortification was any longer safe. Army Chief of Staff Umezu added what had once been unthinkable. The atomic bomb didn't just force new tactics, it turned Japan's whole vision of war upside down. Concentrated forces were now just easy targets, cities mere bullseyes for destruction, and the notion of fighting to the last citizen was moot when the enemy could erase a population from afar. By nightfall, intelligence was pessimistic. America was estimated to have additional atomic weapons, perhaps as many as 7, with the capacity to make more. Even if the stockpile was smaller, the strategic outcome did not change. Continued resistance had become indistinguishable from suicide. As August wore on, the devastation drove matters toward the breaking point. Cabinet Secretary Sakomizu, jotted down the emperor's private words: "The unendurable must be endured." For the first time, Japan's highest office acknowledged out loud that continued resistance would annihilate the nation, and that surrender, however bitter, was the only way forward. On August 10th, a surrender proposal was officially dispatched through Swiss diplomatic channels. It came with a condition: the emperor's sovereignty had to be preserved. Washington's response, delivered 2 days later, was calculatedly vague, promising only that the emperor's future role would depend on the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. This ambiguity fractured the last unity among Japan's commanders. General Anami and hardliners saw ambiguity not as hope, but as humiliation. The surrender debate was no longer about winning or losing. Instead, it centered on choosing between obliteration or the pain of occupation and foreign judgment. As August slipped into September, surrender negotiations languished, yet the psychological shift among military leadership was complete. No longer clinging to fantasy, they were left reconciling themselves to a defeat that extended far beyond the loss of territory or men. It was a reckoning with everything they'd ever believed about war, power, and their own place within it. When the formal surrender finally took place aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, the physical reality of American strength was impossible to ignore. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, tasked with signing the document, wrote later in his diary of an awe-filled harbor, an armada of warships stretching beyond the horizon, skies packed with planes, the sheer size of the force eclipsing anything Japan had fielded at its prime. General Umezu, representing the Imperial General Staff, noted that the surrender wasn't just symbolic. The Missouri itself, constructed in the span it took Japan to plan a single operation, stood as testament to what industrial might could achieve. America had built dozens of such ships while waging war on 2 fronts and developing atomic weapons, while Japan had spent years in careful preparation and been undone inside months. As American occupation forces landed throughout August and September, Japanese observers chronicled a logistics system, a medical infrastructure, and an organizational capacity that matched and surpassed everything predicted in the pre-war reports they'd once chosen to ignore. One American infantry division arrived with more vehicles than the entire Imperial Army possessed. Supply chains, medical care, and materiel demonstrated that victory lay not in spirit alone, but in the ability to bring resources to bear with overwhelming efficiency. In the first months of occupation, the bitter truth was compiled into official assessments, none more searing than Colonel Sato's final report, titled "Why We Lost." The document, preserved in Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, was unsparing. He concluded the war was effectively lost in December 1941, at the very moment Japan attacked an adversary it fundamentally misunderstood. All the battles and sacrifices that followed had simply played out a grim equation already set in motion. Sato's findings detailed America's breathtaking advantages: 10 to 20 times Japan's industrial capacity, a scientific establishment surpassing the country's entire educated workforce, and a nearly bottomless pool of raw resources. The American homeland kept producing both civilian comforts and war materials in tandem, outpacing and outlasting Japan at every turn. Interviews and conversations with occupation historians confirmed this humbling realization. Senior figures such as former Prime Minister Suzuki admitted that Japanese leadership had gravely underestimated America's social and economic flexibility. Far from being a nation of merchants distracted by comfort, the United States proved to be a society capable of dedicating extraordinary resources to both consumer life and total war, simultaneously winning on every front. As American administrators began sharing details of war production, the scale of defeat became undeniably clear. The statistics were staggering: over 88,000 tanks, 257,000 artillery pieces, 2.4 million trucks, 17 million rifles, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. all manufactured while American civilians enjoyed standards of living higher than Japan had ever managed in peacetime. Japanese scientists, granted piecemeal access to the Manhattan Project's workings, were humbled by the enormity and complexity involved. With entire cities built to fuel the bomb's creation, the project required more electricity and technical expertise than the Japanese scientific community could have dreamed of. The bomb, Japan learned, was not just a weapon. It was proof of an entirely different order of civilization, one where science and industry joined forces beyond what the old world believed possible. For a generation of officers trained to believe in raw spirit and sacrifice, these revelations forced a reckoning. Admiral Toyota's post-war reflections captured the shift. The qualities once condemned, democracy, diversity, material wealth, turned out to be the ingredients that enabled American innovation and unity. Japan's founding myths, he admitted, had been reversed by hard experience. Virtues they believed made Americans weak had, in fact, been their greatest strengths. The impact of this transformation reverberated through Japan's leadership in ways that could never be undone. For some, like General Anami, the guilt and magnitude of misjudgment led them to seek death rather than face a world remade by such overwhelming error. Others, such as Admiral Yonai, pivoted to fervent advocacy for demilitarization, determined to prevent future generations from repeating the blindness that had led to catastrophe. Under occupation supervision, Japanese historians began untangling the web of denial and delusion that sustained the war. They documented how honest reports were dismissed as defeatist, how intelligence was filtered for optimism, and how reality was endlessly recast as a temporary setback. Truth, they realized, had become a threat to doctrine, and policy was built on hope instead of fact. Perhaps the most bitter realization was that American power, devastating as it had become, was never fully exerted. While Japan put forth every scrap into the fight, the United States waged war on 2 continents, keeping forces in reserve, developing the next generation of weapons, always holding something back. The atomic bomb wasn't a measure of peak American strength, but merely a glimpse of their untapped potential. When American officials interviewed Japan's surviving military leadership in the years that followed, they recorded testimonies laced with hard-won humility. General Umezu, who had once overseen the nation's war effort, summed up what his peers had learned with painful clarity. "We lost because we never truly understood our enemy. We projected our own limitations onto them, imagining their weaknesses echoed ours, when in reality, their strengths were a world apart. We believed propaganda over intelligence, comforted ourselves with myths, and learned too late that resolve cannot conquer chemistry, nor courage overwhelm steel. Determination means little if your opponent can summon 10 times its physical expression." The war's end marked not just a military defeat, but the dismantling of illusions that, left unchecked, became the architects of disaster. Spirit and sacrifice alone cannot prevail when the adversary commands a greater vision, deeper resources, and the flexibility to innovate continually. Through Hiroshima and its aftermath, the world saw not just the destructive power of the atomic age, but the cost of misunderstanding, arrogance, and self-deception. Japan's reckoning remains a lesson not only in military history, but in the peril of believing one's own story over the unfolding reality.